Hi everyone, we are still in audit sampling, and I'm very happy to welcome you to a special segment of our discussion. And this is, of course, where we try to apply the concepts we have previously discussed on audit sampling to the multiple choice questions. So, this will be a good way for us to practice how to apply what we have just learned once it is being stated or asked in MCQ format. So, there are a total of 55 questions that I have compiled for this particular topic, but in order to avoid a very lengthy video, I have decided to divide the 55 questions unequally into two parts. So we will discuss the first 30 questions here in part one, and I'm hoping that you get to join me again in part two as we discuss the remaining 25 questions. So let us start with our very first question. We are asked in determining the number of documents to select for a test to obtain assurance that all sales returns have been properly authorized. Therefore, at that point, we already know the auditor is performing a test of control. An auditor should consider the tolerable rate of deviation from the control activity. So essentially, because the auditor is performing tests of controls, the auditor is interested, or the auditor must determine or consider the tolerable rate of deviation. Now, we recall when we talk about tolerable rates, they have an inverse relationship to the sample size. So, what this question basically is asking us are what are the factors that will affect the determination of sample size for test of controls? And it has already given us one, which is the tolerable rate, which, as we have just mentioned, has an inverse relationship. In addition to the tolerable rate, the auditor should also consider number one, the likely rate of deviations. And to this, we say yes. The likely rate of deviations is also called the expected rate of deviations. And we know that if it's an expected rate of deviation, then the relationship to sample size is direct. So, number one, that's a yes. Number two, allowable risk of assessing control risk too high. And then we recall between type 1 and type 2 risk in terms of test of controls, the risk of assessing control risk too high is actually a type 1 risk. This is the risk of under reliance. And so for this one, if we have assessed control risk too high, this is not actually what the auditor wishes to control because the auditor is interested in controlling ARO, the acceptable risk of over reliance, which is a type 2 risk, which is the allowable risk of assessing control risk too low. So I'm afraid it's going to be a yes to number one, but a no to number two because we are concerned with ARO, not the type 1 risk. And so, therefore, the answer to this one is delta. We get to consider the tolerable rate and the likely rate of deviations because the other consideration we need to make is on the acceptable risk of over reliance, not under reliance. So let's move on to the next question. The tolerable rate of deviation set by the auditor for tests of controls depends primarily on which of the following. So essentially, we are being asked what affects the tolerable rate of deviation or that rate of deviation that we are willing to accept and still be okay to conclude that the controls are effective. So letter A, the peso amount of substantive misstatements. Letter B, the planned risk of assessing control risk too low. Letter C, the anticipated cause of the errors. Or letter D, the tolerable rate used in audits of other clients in the same industry. So again, we're talking about the tolerable rate of deviation, the rate of deviation that you are willing to accept and still be okay with the controls. Okay, now we get to remember that ideally the order of the testing would be test of controls and then substantive test of transactions, and then you will have your substantive test of balances. And so, therefore, it cannot be letter A, as the peso amount of the substantive misstatements would have ideally followed the test of control. Letter B is the planned risk of assessing control risk too low. And again, if you assess control risk too low, that means you relied on the controls when in fact it was not reliable. So, this now represents our acceptable risk of over reliance. So the tolerable rate of deviation is of course affected by our ARO or the acceptable risk of over reliance. The anticipated cause of the errors would contribute to the auditor's determination of the expected deviation rate rather than the tolerable rate of deviation. So, and of course, the tolerable rate used in audits of other clients in the same industry, while maybe used as a benchmark, but then understanding that each client has a different system of internal controls, it may not be a very wise idea for us to simply benchmark on what we have used in our other clients. So, therefore, the answer to this one is bravo. Moving on to the next question, an attribute sampling plan. And then we stop for a while and we try to recall when we talk about attribute sampling, you're talking about an attribute or a characteristic. Therefore, an attribute sampling plan is mainly used to statistically test for controls. So it's a statistical sampling used for test of controls. So an attribute sampling plan may be used to test the effectiveness of controls. The auditor's evaluation of the sampling results ordinarily leads to a conclusion concerning letter A, the relation of the population deviation rate to the tolerable rate, or letter B, the population value not being misstated by more than a predetermined amount. Or letter C, the population characteristics occurring at least once in the population. Or letter D, monetary precision exceeding a certain predetermined amount. And for this, we once again recall this is test of controls, and therefore, with that, we could already effectively eliminate choice B because it talks about a misstatement of a value, which is more appropriate for substantive testing. And we could also already eliminate choice D or delta because, again, it is referring to a monetary precision, more appropriate for substantive testing. This now leaves us with two remaining choices, either alpha or Charlie. Now, in the case of Charlie, a population characteristic occurring at least once in the population reflects that which we call discovery sampling. So, if you would remember, discovery sampling is the design of a sample size sufficient to include even just one deviation, and that one deviation would already be enough for the auditor to conclude that the entire population or the entire sample is misstated. And so, with that, while still being a special type of sampling for test of controls, but we do not generally perform discovery sampling unless there is a suspicion of fraud. And so, therefore, to represent attribute sampling in general, we have the answer, of course, to this will be letter A. We are concerned with the relation of the population deviation rate to the tolerable rate. The idea is always that we do not wish the tolerable rate to be breached by the deviations that we have found in the sample or that which eventually will be projected to the entire population. However, we also recall that in the case of test of controls, there is no explicit projection technique to the population, as it is almost always impossible for us to determine the entire population of controls. Nonetheless, when we perform sampling for test of controls, our concern is that the deviations do not breach that which we consider to be acceptable or tolerable, or that which we are willing to accept. So the answer to this is alpha. Next, an auditor is applying probability proportional to size sampling. And to this, we recall the characteristic of a probability proportional to size sampling is that it uses the peso amount as the sampling unit. Therefore, the larger the balance of an account or a transaction, then the bigger is the chance of it to be selected. So, in the case of probability proportional to size sampling, while we are talking about amounts and balances, this actually still uses the attribute theory. So it's the application of an attribute theory, but this time applied to monetary balances. Okay, so in determining the sample size, which of the following does not need to be known in the case of PPS or probability proportional to size sampling? Letter A talks about a reliability factor for overstatement errors. And to this, we recall when the auditor performs probability proportional to size or value weighted selection, the idea being that the larger balances get a larger chance of being selected. And so, therefore, with that, we are saying PPS is more appropriate when you are testing for overstatements. Okay, so letter A is a yes, it has to be known. Tolerable error, okay, or tolerable misstatement is also considered, as we know this will have an effect on your sample size. The book value of the population is also needed in the performance of probability proportional to size, as the basis for selecting the item is essentially the balance of the items. So we do need the book value. What does not need to be known is a reliability factor for understatement errors. As what we have previously pointed out in the case of PPS, it becomes a very big challenge in the case, for example, of zero balances or negative balances. PPS, or probability proportional to size, or value weighted selection, is not effective in testing for understatements. So the answer is delta. Let us now move on to the next question. While performing a test of details, so test of details would then, of course, represent substantive testing. So while performing a test of details during an audit, the auditor determined that the sample results supported the conclusion that the recorded account balance was materially misstated. Meaning to say, our sample results showed that the account balance is materially misstated, meaning to say further that if it is materially misstated according to the sample, we have actually rejected it because we thought it was materially misstated. But the truth is, it is not materially misstated. So, therefore, this situation illustrates the risk of rejecting something that would have been acceptable. So, this is the risk of incorrect rejection. Next question. In examining cash disbursements, an auditor plans to choose a sample using systematic selection with a random start. The primary advantage of this selection technique is that population items, so if you recall our previous discussion when we talk about random selection, sometimes the simple random selection presents a challenge if the sampling units are not logically arranged. And so therefore we said, well, if that's the case, not a problem. We could always use systematic selection. In the case of systematic selection, this is where we compute a sampling interval. And then we would normally get a random start, and then every nth item becomes part of our sample size. So therefore, with this, the units do not actually have to be logically arranged. Okay. However, we have also pointed out that there are some advantages and disadvantages to this technique. Now, for this question, we are being asked what is the primary advantage of systematic selection? Letter A says that are indicative of fraud, or population items that are indicative of fraud will be included in the sample, or B, do not have to be pre-numbered in order for the auditor to use the technique. Or letter C, population items may occur more than once in a sample. Or letter D, the population items may occur in a systematic pattern, thus making the sample more representative. We once again highlight the fact that what we are looking at is the primary advantage, and the primary advantage is that the sampling units do not have to be logically arranged and they do not have to be pre-numbered, as we could easily use the physical arrangement of, or the physical location of the sampling units in order to draw out the sample size, okay, or in order to select rather the sampling units. We do recall that in the case of systematic selection, if the units are arranged in a systematic pattern, it actually destroys the element of randomness, and so therefore it might lead you to a non-representative sample. That is the disadvantage. But pointing to the advantage, it would be that the population items do not have to be pre-numbered. Next question. Which of the following courses of action would an auditor most likely follow in planning a sample of cash disbursements if the auditor is aware of several unusually large cash disbursements? Okay, so what is the concern of the auditor? Several unusually large cash disbursements. Letter A, continue to draw new samples until the unusually large disbursements appear in the sample. Or letter B, stratify the cash disbursements population so that the unusually large disbursements are selected. Or letter C, increase the sample size to reduce the effect of the unusually large disbursements. Or letter D, set the tolerable rate of deviation at a lower level than originally planned. Letter D being reflective of an auditor has decided to take a stricter approach to the testing. So for this, we recall that, well, in cases of variability, in the expected variability present in the population, the auditor normally performs what we call a stratification. So when the auditor stratifies, the auditor then groups items of a homogeneous characteristic. And normally, in the cases of substantive testing, the grouping is based on the balances. This somehow gives the auditor reasonable assurance that those items with very large balances would be represented, and even those items which have middling balances or even very low balances or small balances would have also a reasonable chance of being part of the sample. So in this case, if there are several unusually large cash disbursements, the most efficient thing for the auditor to do is to stratify the population. That way, the auditor is assured that the unusually large disbursements have their own stratum and therefore has increased the chance of these unusually large cash disbursements to be part of your sample. Next question. Which of the following is true if certain forms are not consecutively numbered? So this is once again our concern if the sampling units are not logically arranged, or in this case, they do not have, or rather, they are not pre-numbered. Letter A, selection of a random sample probably is not possible. Or letter B, systematic sampling may be appropriate. Or letter C, random number tables cannot be used. Or letter D, stratified sampling should be used. We start by discussing letter D, and we recall that stratified sampling, especially in terms, for example, of substantive tests, are essentially used to reduce the variability, okay, of a particular, or the expected variability of a particular population. It does not necessarily address the lack of pre-numbering. So it's not delta. In the case of alpha and Charlie, which basically makes a reference to simple random selection or random sampling, actually the truth is you may still use random sampling. You may still use random number tables. It's just going to be a little bit more challenging and also less efficient if the items are not pre-numbered or are not logically arranged. So therefore, in the case of the absence of pre-numbering, systematic sampling may be appropriate. So the answer is bravo. Next, population, as defined in PSA 530, means the entire set of data from which a sample is selected and about which the auditor wishes to draw conclusions. It is important for the auditor to ensure that the population is appropriate, and to that we say yes, and complete, and to that we also say yes. In the case of substantive testing with an anticipated high variability in the population, then the auditor will also consider stratification. That would be number three in case of substantive testing. So in this case, the answer is both one and two. Moving on to the next question. When performing a test of control with respect to control over cash receipts, so we're talking about test of controls over cash receipts, an auditor may use systematic sampling technique with a start at any randomly selected item. The biggest disadvantage of this type of sampling is that the items in the population, so a while back we were able to answer a question about systematic selection looking for the advantage. This time we're on the flip side. We're looking for the disadvantage. And according to our choices, we have letter A, it may systematically occur more than once in the sample. Letter B, must be systematically replaced in the population after sampling, meaning to say once you have chosen a sampling unit, you have to return it back to the population. You have to return it to the population. Letter C, must be recorded in a systematic pattern before the sample can be drawn. Or letter D, may occur in a systematic pattern, thus destroying the sample randomness. So we do remember that a disadvantage of systematic selection is once the population or the sampling units are arranged in a pattern, then it will result to a higher likelihood of not getting a representative sample. So the disadvantage is it may occur in a systematic pattern, thus destroying the sample randomness, and ergo will affect the possibility of getting a representative sample. So delta is the answer to this question. Next, the size of a sample designed for dual purpose testing. So, what is a dual purpose test? Well, it's essentially a test that will serve a dual purpose. The dual purpose being that it's a test that can be used as a test of control and as a substantive test at the same time. Now, what if we are performing a dual purpose testing? But if we look at the sample size, had it been purely test of controls, it would have only been, let's just say for purposes of this illustration, 10. But if you look at the sample size, had it been purely for substantive testing, then it would have been 50. So, but now you're performing a dual purpose testing. Which particular sample size will prevail? Is it the 10 from test of controls, or is it the 50 from substantive testing? Or do we simply add both and then come up with 60, or maybe get the average and then say 30? How do we decide the sample size in the case of a dual purpose test? Letter A says the combined total of the samples, so you add 10 and 50. Or letter B, you choose the smaller of the samples. So in the case of our illustration, we go for 10. Or letter C, we go for the larger sample size. And in the case of our illustration, that would have been the 50. Or in the case of letter D, it says more than the higher of the samples that would otherwise have been designated for the two separate purposes. So in our illustration, that's 50, but less than the combined total of the samples that would have otherwise been designed for the two separate purposes. So letter D would say it should be greater than 50, but less than 60. All right, but if you think about it, if you have to choose between 10 and 50, which one would you go? Of course, the auditor will always be erring on the side of caution. And so in this case, the auditor would choose the larger of the samples. So even if test of controls would have only required 10 and substantive testing would have required 50, when performing a dual purpose test, we take the 50 as the sample size. We choose the larger of the two samples. This is our way of erring on the side of caution. So Charlie for this question. Next, three conditions must be met for difference or ratio estimation to be used. Now, these are the projection techniques that we talked about in our previous video. And then we also illustrated the fact that in terms of difference estimation is more concerned about the misstatement per unit. But if you talk about ratio estimation, it's the ratio of the misstatement found in the sample. Which of the following is not one of the three conditions when we decide to use ratio or difference estimation? Letter A, there must be some difference between the audited value and the recorded book value. Or letter B, the total population book value must agree to the sum of the individual population book values. So, meaning to say, in the case of detailed tie-in, right? So, the detailed listing must agree with the total population book value. Letter C, each population item must have a book value. Or letter D, the expected error rate must be more than the tolerable error rate. And actually, not one of the condition is delta. Because if you imagine, for example, if you are already expecting an error rate of, let's just say, 10%, but then you're only willing to tolerate 2%, then do not perform the test of controls anymore if in the case of test of controls, right? So if the expected error rate is already greater than the tolerable error rate, you expect, for example, the error to be 50,000, but you're only willing to tolerate up to 10,000. So there may no longer be any need for you to perform the sampling as it's already expected to revolve or to reveal rather a material misstatement or a deviation or a deviation in the sample that is more than what you're willing to accept. So in that case, the auditor may consider performing 100% testing, okay, in order to give the auditor sufficient and appropriate evidence. So ideally, we perform sampling and of course the related projection if the tolerable rate is greater than what you expect, because then it would make sense for you to do sampling, right? Okay, so in this case, letter D is not one of the three conditions. We are being asked now for an element of sampling risk. Which one is an element of sampling risk? Failing to detect a deviation on a document inspected by the auditor. In the case of letter A, it's the fault of the auditor, not the fault of the sample. Remember, when the sample and the auditor would have a conversation over coffee or lunch, if we're talking about sampling risk, the auditor will say sample it's you. You are the problem. You're the one na may pagkukulang, nasa iyo yung mali. Sample, the problem is with you. That is sampling risk. When the sample is not representative, when the sample is too small, when the sample was selected using inappropriate sample selection techniques, like for example, the auditor only used, say for example, block selection good for 1 month. So everything that has something to do with the sample is sampling risk. But on the flip side, when you talk about non-sampling risk, this time the auditor will say, sample, it's not you, it's me. I'm the one who is deficient. I'm the one at fault. I'm the one who has the pagkukulang. And so therefore, in the case of letter A, the deviation is already in the sample and still the auditor did not see it. It's the fault of the auditor. Okay. Next, choosing a sample size that is too small to achieve the sampling objective. So what is the reason why the sampling objective was not met? Because the sample size is too small. So it is now a problem of the sample. So the answer to this is bravo. When you talk about choosing an audit procedure that is inconsistent with the audit objective, meaning to say it is possible that you already got a representative sample, but the procedure that you have chosen is not the correct one. You wanted to test, for example, for understatements, and yet you chose to perform vouching. So this time, it's not a problem of the sample, it's the problem of the procedure. Or failing to perform audit procedures that are required by the sampling plan. So the sample may be representative, but the auditor failed to perform the procedure. So again, not a problem of the sample, it's a problem of the auditor. So the answer to this is bravo. Moving forward to the next question, which of the following sampling methods could be designed to estimate the peso value of an audit population? So if it's a peso value, we of course refer to substantive testing. And so for this, it is sampling for variables. So bravo is the answer. Next question. In determining the number of items to be selected in a sample for a particular substantive test of details. So a while back, we had a similar question, but it was for test of controls. This time, it's going to be for substantive test of details. The auditor should consider all of the following except letter A, tolerable misstatement. And in the case of tolerable misstatement, we know the relationship to sample size is inverse. Allowable risk of incorrect acceptance, this is area. And for area, we also know that the relationship is inverse. Characteristics of the population may refer perhaps to the variability being noticed in the population. And once again, if there is a high variability, the auditor will consider stratifying the population. So what is not considered is the deviation rate because you are, after all, performing substantive test of details. So this should be delta. Next, in designing audit procedures, the auditor is required to determine appropriate means of selecting items for testing to gather audit evidence. Which of the following means is or are available to the auditor? And to this, we know it's all of the three, right? The auditor may choose to test the entire population. The auditor may set criteria as to which items to choose, and so therefore selecting specific items. And of course, the auditor may perform audit sampling. So why is it 1 and 2 only? The answer to this should be 1, 2, and 3 for a while. There you have it. We have corrected the answer. It should be alpha 1, 2, and 3. Next, what is the primary objective of using stratification as a sampling method in auditing? Letter A would say to determine the precision range of the sample selected, or B, decrease the effect of variance in the total population, or C, increase the confidence level at which a decision will be reached from the results of the sample selected, or delta, determine the occurrence rate for a given characteristic in the population being studied. Now, we have talked in length about stratification, and we know that it is intended to decrease the effect of variance. We also recall in the case of the measurement of stratification, or rather in the case of measurement of variability, we make use of standard deviation, or one way for us, or one particular statistic that we would be looking at would be standard deviation to determine if variability is high or low in that particular sample or population. So bravo is the answer to this question. Next, we are asked, what is the purpose of peso value estimation? Letter A, to estimate the rate of control error. But we are being asked about peso value estimation, and letter A is more concerned about control errors. Or B, to test the reasonableness of a recorded account balance. Or letter C, test for the occurrence of one single significant control error. reminiscent of discovery sampling, or D, estimate an account balance. So in this case, the answer, of course, is the estimation of an account balance, similar to when we discussed mean per unit projection technique, right? So it allows rather the auditor to estimate an account balance even in the absence of a book value in the population. So the answer is delta. Peso value estimation is similar to mean per unit estimation, by the way. One of the items selected in an attribute sample cannot be located by the client. What do we do with missing items? The auditor should treat the missing item as a deviation when evaluating the sample, or B, treat the missing item in the same manner as a majority of the other sample members or sampling units, or letter C, evaluate the result of the sample for one less than the original sample size, meaning to say you will deduct, okay, from the sample size that one missing item, or select another item to replace the missing item. So generally, if an item is missing, the auditor has to investigate why it is missing. If the auditor cannot perform alternative procedures, then the auditor will treat the missing item as a deviation when evaluating the sample. So that's alpha. So look for the missing item, investigate why it's missing, and then endeavor to perform alternative procedures. Otherwise, treat it as a deviation. Next, in planning a statistical sample for a test of controls, an auditor increased the expected population deviation rate from the prior year's rate because of the results of the prior year's test of controls and the overall control environment. So we also recall that the sources of our expected deviation rate may either come from prior year's testing or results of prior year's testing, or an initial testing or a pilot testing. So in this case, the auditor decided to increase the expected population deviation rate. The auditor most likely would then increase the planned letter A sample size, or B tolerable deviation rate, or C allowance for sampling risk, or D the risk of assessing control risk too low. And then we recall the relationships, and then we said if it's an expected population deviation rate, then it will increase the sample size because they have a direct relationship. So the answer to this is alpha. What are the principal methods of selecting samples? The random number tables or CATs. Systematic selection. Actually, random number tables can be present through CATs. Okay, systematic selection and haphazard selection. For this, all of these three are, of course, principal methods of selecting samples, as what we have previously discussed. So this should be alpha. The auditor increases the expected population deviation rate. Again, expected population deviation rate has a direct relationship to sample size, and so therefore sample size will definitely be larger. So that's bravo. If a selected random number is for avoided transaction. So a while back we talked about a missing item. This time we're talking about avoided transactions. So the transaction should be replaced in the sample. However, the auditor should first ascertain that the transaction was. So if you would recall, we are saying if it lands on a voided document, you must first investigate if it is properly voided. If it is properly voided, then you can replace it in the sample. Otherwise, it will be treated as a misstatement. So since the auditor here has decided to replace it or to replace the voided document, then it must have meant that it was properly voided. So again, if it lands on a voided document, investigate first, is the voiding legit? Is the voiding authorized? Okay, if it has been properly voided, if yes, then we replace it. Otherwise, the answer would have been to treat it as a deviation. So the answer is delta. The desired allowance for sampling risk is also called the desired standard deviation, but again, standard deviation would refer to the variability in the sample. Letter B, desired precision. Letter C, desired acceptable risk of incorrect rejection. But then, if you would remember, it has always been the super twins arrow and aria, right? Acceptable risk of over reliance and acceptable risk of incorrect acceptance. We have not yet determined or even considered, we do not consider acceptable risk of incorrect rejection, or the planned sampling risk. The allowance for sampling risk is also called your desired precision. So just another terminology to refer to the allowance for sampling risk. Audit sampling involves the letter A selection of all items over a certain amount. Doing that, however, means that the auditor has already a preset or predetermined criteria, the criteria being a certain amount, right? So letter A is more appropriate for selecting specific items. Or letter B, application of audit procedures to all items. That should be to all items over a certain amount, and those that are unusual or have a history of error against specific selection. That's letter B. Letter C, application of audit procedures to less than 100% within a class of transaction or account balance such that all items have a chance of selection. This one, letter C, then represents audit sampling. We are being shown a diagram, and this diagram is actually very commonly used for auditing theory illustrations of audit sampling. In fact, this must have come from one of the many materials that we have sourced this compilation of questions from. But we are being shown a diagram which depicts the auditor's estimated maximum deviation rate compared with the tolerable rate, and also depicts the true population deviation rate compared with the tolerable rate. We are being asked to identify which of the four quadrants would represent that the auditor has assessed control risk too high. So if the auditor assesses control risk too high, that means the sample results show that the controls are not reliable. When we say the controls are not reliable, then that must mean, let's pull out a highlighter, that must mean that the maximum, this is the result of the sample right here. According to this, control risk is high, so we did not rely. So when we did not rely, that means the maximum deviation rate exceeds the tolerable rate. That's the reason why we did not rely, because it has breached the tolerable rate. However, because we're saying we assessed or the auditor assessed it too high, meaning to say based on the sample, it's not reliable. But if you look at the true state of the population, the true state of the population is actually that it is reliable, meaning to say it has not breached, the deviations have not breached, it has not reached the tolerable rate. So this one then would be represented by quadrant number 3, and that should be delta. And this is what we normally say, that we don't memorize which quadrant represents what particular risk, because the x-axis and the y-axis may change, so you just have to analyze what the quadrants are trying to tell you. So in this case, assessing control risk too high, or the risk of under reliance. You did not rely. This is your type 1 risk, is represented by the third quadrant, and that is, of course, delta. All right, so I think we have reached 30 questions. No, not yet. I thought we have reached 30 questions. I think that was, I don't know, maybe question number 29. So let's go to the next question. As a result of test of controls, an auditor assessed control risk too low. By assessing control risk too low, that means the auditor decided to rely on the controls. But the truth is the controls are not reliable. Okay, so because the auditor over relied on the controls, the auditor decreased substantive testing. This assessment occurred because the true deviation rate in the population was, again, you relied on the unreliable. That means the true deviation rate has actually breached. It has gone over and beyond what you were willing to accept. So the true deviation rate was actually more than the deviation rate in the auditor's sample. Okay, so had you only known the truth, you would have seen that the entire population had so much more deviation rate than what you saw in your sample. So this is the risk of over reliance. So the answer to this is Charlie. Right? If the size of the sample to be used in a particular test of attributes has not been determined by utilizing statistical concepts, meaning to say in this case the auditor used a non-statistical sampling approach, right? So not been determined using statistical, so meaning it's non-statistical, but the sample has been randomly chosen. So non-stat, but random selection, which is allowed, right? Because non-statistical sampling plans can use both probabilistic and non-probabilistic, so no problem here. Okay. In the case of this scenario, letter A, the auditor may not use statistical evaluation because at the very start, that's a non-statistical sampling, right? So non-statistical sampling plan, you may have chosen the sample using probabilistic, but once you go to the evaluation, you must go back to non-statistical evaluation because at the very start, it was a non-statistical sampling. Okay, so that's letter A. Or letter B, the auditor will have to evaluate the results by reference to the principles of discovery sampling, which is a very specific, very special type of sampling. Letter C, the auditor has committed a non-sampling error, but the non-sampling error or non-sampling risk has got something to do with the auditor and not the sample. Or no inferences can be drawn from the sample. I suppose the auditor got tired of choosing from all of the choices. So in this case, the correct answer, of course, is alpha. So when you are using non-statistical sampling, even when you are allowed to use probabilistic sample selection techniques, but at the end of the day, when you evaluate, you must go back to the very heart of what you did, and that is non-statistical. And then we move on to question number 30, I think. I think this is question number 30, which would essentially signal the end of part one. So, question number 30, an auditor is performing substantive test of pricing and extensions of perpetual inventory balances consisting of a large number of items. Past experience indicates numerous pricing extension errors. Which of the following statistical sampling approaches is most appropriate? Do we go for probability proportional to size, ratio estimation, stop or go, or unstratified mean per unit? We do recognize in this case that the errors are on the pricing. So because the errors are on the pricing, meaning to say it will be more appropriate to use ratio estimation, as you could attribute it mainly to the balance, okay, the pricing rather than the individual units. Okay, so the answer to this one is bravo, ratio estimation. And yes, that is part one. We have answered questions 1 to 30 in a few. Once you are ready, you might want to, take a very short break, maybe take a sip of water, coffee, or maybe do some stretching, just a bit of light stretching. And whenever you're ready, I hope to see you in the next video, which will be part two of the multiple choice questions, covering the remaining 25 questions for this module. Once again, allow me to tell you that these questions are not mine. I did not personally make these questions. Rather, this is compiled from a variety of sources, review materials, texts, and the like. So thank you for joining me in part one, and I hope to see all of you in the second part.